Next panel, which is navigating the future of identity. So in this digital age, managing identity is key to security and trust. How can we navigate the future of identity while ensuring privacy and accessibility? Our next panel will delve into the complexities and innovations driving this space. So today we have our wonderful moderator, David. David is partner at Cornwallis Law and More. So we'll give a round of applause to our panellists for today.
Thanks, Lucinda. As Lucinda said, I'm a partner at Cornwallis in the Banking and Finance, FinTech, Privacy and Emerging Technologies group. Our firm's been around since 1891, but certainly keeping pace with new technologies. In this forum, it's a given that innovation brings with it new opportunities and products. But in lockstep with all of that, fraud, cyber risk is rightly front of mind for all of us. Certainly these issues keep our clients up at night, and we are seeing increasing numbers of clients being approached by players in the digital ID market. There's some federal and state regulatory scaffolding in place already. Certainly at the Commonwealth level, we had the Digital ID Act that was proclaimed in May and comes into effect in December. I promise it's not hyperbole when I say we've got a really fantastic panel of experts to walk us through what we can expect to see in the digital ID market in coming years. In alphabetical order and moving from left to right, may I start with Andrew Black. Andrew's the Managing Director of ID Connect, which is part of the Australian Payments Plus network. ID Connect is Australia's first private sector digital ID exchange in partnership with major banks. Andrew is an established leader in the digital ID industry, working with federal government and with state governments. Andrew hails from Scotland, and he has led ventures on data and cyber for many years, including in open banking and other innovative projects for major banks in the UK. Cassandra. Cassandra Ma is the Executive Director of Credential and Identity Policy at the Victorian Department of Government Services. Cassandra is an experienced leader who translates ideas into strategy and then implements them. Cassandra leads a talented team responsible for developing Victoria's credential and identity policy, supporting national policy, and leading policy advice for Services Victoria. I understand that thanks to Cassandra and her team, Victorians can effect over 90 government transactions through Services Victoria at a time and place convenient to them. I'm told that over 2.4 million identities have been verified through Services Victoria. Paul, last but not least, Paul Warren Tape. Paul is the General Manager for Global Risk and Compliance at IDVerse, which is a part of the global OCR Labs group. Paul has over 20 years of global experience in governance, risk, privacy, and compliance. Paul has spent 10 years in the Australian financial services industry before moving into the startup world. Those of us who have been engaged with Paul know that he's engaged and passionate about helping organizations solve complex problems and drive innovation through encouraging new ways of doing things and approaches in a way that's consistent with legal requirements. With that introduction, I might just ask our panel one by one to set the stage. There's a bit of definitional murkiness around this whole question about identity. So, Andrew, I might throw to you to just talk about identity and digital identity.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the rebrand of ID Connect. Now, Yeah, I think it's really important just to look at sort of where we are today and also how we got there and what the definition of identity means, because it's very different to people depending on either your circumstance or the transaction you're in. So we've sort of broadly, over the last, sort of 30, 40 years, evolved from a world where you take paper and plastic credentials, you present them to somebody, and that's sort of the form of identity. And then we've sort of slapped cameras over the top of it, or in some cases do scans and photocopies and continue to call that identity. And really now we're starting to move over in the last sort of couple of years, and where the sort of future gets towards is how do you make that truly digital and reusable. And I'm really excited for our panel today because we all have sort of unique roles in that ecosystem. So Connect ID is a network. We're a digital identity network that allows you to reuse a trusted organization you've already set up as your identity provider, such as a bank or a state government. And that's really what we're seeing as a sort of trend going forwards. But that sort of 30, 40-year history is really important because what it's led to is Australia being Olympic world champions in cyber breaches. Right, we've had didn't get the top spot at the Olympics this year, but we win the gold medal in cyber breaches, right? Because we store unnecessary amounts of data, right? So it makes a lot of our businesses very attractive as a proposition to hack or attack, and when it does, the impact is great. So sort of 2 out of 3 Australians have had their data breached, and the cost of businesses is massive, right? So the average cost to a business impacted by a cyber breach is sort of 4.6 million, I think, on average, in terms of fines and also sort of restorative costs. So it's been a big problem, and I think that's where we see the future opportunity across the ecosystem board, that it needs the organizations like ourselves and others to work together to fix that and truly digitize sort of where we are today.
Thanks, Andrew. I might talk to you, Cassandra, for your view.
Yeah, so just following on from what Andrew said, in Victoria there's been quite a bit of work done since 2018 to develop really consistent approaches to proving identity. David mentioned that through Service Victoria you can now verify your identity since 2018. We've had 2.5 million identities verified. There's a 30% reuse rate on those identities across over 50 transactions available through the Victorian government. And earlier this year we amended the Act to enable the private sector to work with Service Victoria to access Service Victoria services, including those reusable identities. What's really good about that is it starts to lift the bar, as Andrew was talking about, around what identity proofing is, and thinking around the rules and the risk assessments associated with giving access to different services. So, for example, it's much harder to prove your identity to work with kids than it is, for example, to get a fishing licence. And there's good reasons for that. So having those frameworks in place with good process and systems, that can always be strengthened, which is a good segue, I think.
I think, yeah, perfectly. I think inherently doing identity proofing is simple. I am who I say I am. I can turn up with a government-issued document and go, hello, I am Paul. But there's so much complexity underneath because of all of our frameworks of what we have. We now have such a multitude of documentation everywhere, and as Andrew pointed out, cyber breaches Australia #1. But that's because we're using physical identity documents in a digital world. So we're trying to shoehorn in what was usually a face-to-face perspectives. Now we're trying to shoehorn that into a digital world. So how do we prove that when I turn up and actually have a document and take a photo of it? That's actually quite hard to now prove it's a fraudulent document. Now you've got a whole new attack surface from the fraud and the fraudsters thinking about how do we think about taking a photo using generative AI to create a deepfake document and actually start to try and impersonate and actually, so it's, the complexity is thanks to the fraudsters, and they're continually innovative, and that's part of my job to stay across what's going on in that landscape. So that complexity makes it very hard, and to Andrew's point, the physical side and what Cassandra kind of produces is those need to then become into a digital form that we can secure, we can have it as interoperable, and you can look after your own identity. Physical documents are great for that one-to-one. The digital document, you can get it and then start to have access to those products and services. So the identity proofing strength has to be the highest level when we start talking about moving into the digital sense, because if we don't have strong identity proofing and some fraudster gets a digital identity, they now have just got free rein to go everywhere. So we really need to think and concentrate on those frameworks.
Thanks, Paul. And that's a good segue to the next part of the discussion, which is after the intro, we just need to maybe get a bit of content, starting with you, Andrew, on the state of play in federal, private sector, state.
Would you believe is pretty fragmented as a current state? So there's a lot of really good work happening, right? But it's still not entirely joined up. We're not sort of at that point of interoperability. So you think about sort of where we are today. We have a private sector emerging, with organisations such as Connect ID, with banks, and also working with sort of OCR Labs and team there. We also then have a federal government bill, so the Trusted Digital Identity Bill, which was previously a framework and has been draft for sort of 10 years or so, or in a sort of inception for 10 years. 10 years and $700 million later, we're sort of getting to the point of the bill being legislated this year. And that sets out, really from the Department of Finance, the potential rules of the road of an interoperable, long-term, healthy digital identity economy. There's a lot of work to do there. It's not there yet, and it's also not ready or accessible for states and also for private sector to get involved in yet. But there's some good nuggets in there, and some work to do, but some good nuggets in there. But there's lots of other things that keep sprouting up, right? So there's some good and really exciting work being done by Oz Roads, looking at aligning driver license standards across the states. And I'm sure Cassandra will touch on that more, but looking at what's there today and aligning behind ISO standards. But there's also then new things popping up and POCs of sort of techs and trust exchange from Services Australia and the federal government. So it's really still potted, right, in terms of where we are today. But we're seeing really strong use cases in the private sector and the demand for it, and even in the states as well. Individuals are desperate to be able to use something and want to have choice. So there's still a good opportunity there, but there's just there's still a lot of work to join the dots up.
Thanks, Andrew. Cassandra?
Yeah, I think when we think about identity, there's probably three parts that it's worth thinking about we need to work on and get even better at. So the first one is issuing of identity documents. So the point Paul was talking about is we've got to make sure the house of cards is built on a strong basis. There's increasing opportunities with technology to improve that. The second one is the rules around proving identity are really important. So when you use those things that have been created to prove an identity, having a consistent approach to using those rules. And the third thing is transforming into your wallet on your phone where you've got your tokens held. Some of those need to be held at a standard that's interoperable nationally and internationally. And that's when we're starting to talk about the ISO standards, some of the work that Austroad's doing, the states and territories in the Commonwealth looking at establishing a core set of national credentials that follow that ISO standard. And what that does is it helps with what Paul's talking about, is the opportunity to hold digital credentials whereby you as an individual have the choice around what you share with whom, when and how, and the control in your hand literally, and that source is just in one place, rather than the last thing, which was mentioned earlier around cyber breaches, really rethinking some of those policy and legislative frameworks whereby retention of data is required. And you would have seen recently the changes to the AML-CTF requirements that change some of the traditional paper-based approaches to thinking around what records management is, which will enable, hopefully, a decrease in some of those cyber breaches.
Thanks, Cassandra. Paul?
I think just kind of building on that, I think there's a lot of... What annoys me to a degree is there's technology now which can solve for the problem. What we don't have is the regulation and people following that consistently in order to solve the problem. Fraud is rife, it's gone the rise, Gen AI has just created another toolbox for them to actually start using. So we've got the tools at our disposal, they're just not being used consistently across everywhere. And it's the inconsistency is the problem. So that's leaving a weak spot. So it's the weakest chain, so they'll always go and try and find that. So if you get the regulation to start to move in the right direction, the Digital ID Act, great move forward about how do we move forward, how do we solve the fraudulent problems, but it doesn't solve fraud, unfortunately, right now. It's still got a way to go. So we're still kind of agitating and trying to get that to a better position. Because then we start to go, when we start as ourselves, how do we do an identity proofing that you can trust, which is safe, secure and reliable? You need to know it's at a decent level and you can put your trust marks and say every single provider is acting ethically, they're doing it to the right standard and it's secure and it's operable. So even the identity providers need to have that consistency in how they're doing things in order to make sure that this ecosystem stays, because it's all built on trust. It'll erode pretty quickly. Australia's tried this a few times already, the federal kind of identity, and it hasn't quite kind of caught. But I think with a bit more kind of input from the private sector, we're already kind of solving, and the banks are starting to use it. It's starting to you see the scam accord with actually using biometrics to be consistent. It's great steps forward in starting to solve for it, but it just needs to move a bit quicker for me.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Just moving forward a little bit, we've talked about where we are in Australia, and I'd like to just ask each of you how you see this whole area evolving in the, let's say, in the medium term and then in the longer term, how you see it evolving. We've got another set of discussions about what we want, but we'll leave that to one side for the moment and just talk about how you see things evolving in the next few years. Andrew?
Are you going to be? Yeah, cool. Yeah, sure. How do I see it evolving? So we look a little bit overseas at what's gone really well and what's also what's not, as a little bit of an opportunity to understand consumer behaviour, but also understand some of the pitfalls, right, as well. So some examples overseas of what we think are sort of good markets and trends to follow, or particularly in the Nordics. It's a slightly different makeup, but the Nordic market with Bank ID has a penetration of usage of citizens reusing their digital identity over 200 times a year, right, to log into services across economy. So I think that's what good looks like in terms of an economy-wide approach. Similar sort of things happening in Canada, and Intersekt was sort of an opportunity for government and private sector working together. It's a really good news story. The European wallet framework is again another really good example of setting standards, setting a trust framework, but letting citizens have choice and nations have choice of how they're going to meet to that, right, and how we get there. But it's also really important to recognise what we're not. So we often look at some examples, particularly close to this part of the world, of SingPass in Singapore and Aadhaar in India, and then even I guess Estonia always comes up as an example. It's very different from the Australian market and very different from what citizens want, right, in terms of choice, in terms of not having a government mandated ID and just one to use. They want to be able to choose. Do I want to use my state government? Do I want to use my bank? Do I want to use another trusted private sector provider, or use federal government? But what's universal is where we see where there's not a coordinated approach and we have fragmentation, we leave a gap. And that gap is usually filled by Apple and Google, right? And big tech sort of swoop in as the only option and freeze out sort of domestic choice and sovereignty. I'm a loyal Apple user of the products, but I want to be able to choose. Right? I want to be able to choose where I store my data, where I store my identity, and that's where sort of a coordinated, joined-up approach is really needed, and what we've got to learn from the pitfalls as well as what's good elsewhere.
Understand. Thanks, Andrew. Cassandra?
Yeah, so just supporting what Andrew said, we're going to see more reuse of trusted identities and a consolidation around those trusted identities. The role of government's really important in developing identity documents and identities, so that will continue to be quite strong. Where we're going to see further change is the need for reform across the records management requirements around identity, and hopefully that will address a lot of the issues stemming from the cyber breaches. And then probably the final thing is the very strong emergence of reliance on verifiable credentials that have ISO as a basis rather than needing to continually reprove your identity. Proofing will still be important, but the use of credentials and the power of the individual in holding those within the wallet will increase.
Thanks, Cassandra. Paul?
Yeah, I think the moving to owning your own identity, that self-sovereign kind of identity kind of starts to have that data minimization, which we're talking to. We're starting to reduce your kind of attack surface of the fraudsters. Where can I go and get information? They're not after credit cards, they're after your identity documents, because you can grab an identity and create a credit card. It doesn't matter how many times you cancel it, they've got your identity. So that's what we'll start to see, is that minimization, be able to have the control. You know where your identity is, you know what you're sharing, you know where you're sharing it, and you also know what the relying party is going to be doing with it as well. And then once you have that trusted relationship, as Cassandra said, you're going to have that ongoing piece. How do we re-verify back to, can I prove it's you, or through a passkey or through a biometric quickly? Can I, at the end of your phone, when you phone your bank and say, I need to change my details, and they just want, is it really you? And ask you some random wallet questions, which you can probably Google and find out. And the contact centre is usually where the fraudsters go after. The flip side is the fraudsters are going to evolve as well. So we have to be able to move quickly and deal with some of these problems. Like, you think about, we started to see a 6-fold increase in deepfake documents. So there's hundreds of these websites you can go on. It's easy to get 60 seconds, $10 on crypto, and I've got a document with a photo with some stolen information, as it's out there, your information's out there with someone else's photo. You give that to a bank, you're in. But you think about like what that actually looks like from a kind of a normal physical. That's like taking a normal photo of your document, walking into a bank with a little sticker over the front and saying, oh, well, can I actually do this? So it's accessible, it's easy, and they can actually start to do this. So we have to minimize the data, but also then know what these innovative and pesky fraudsters are continually doing, because they're all going to try and beat the system.
Thanks
Also,
very much.
Just now, I think it's a perfect point, actually, because the other thing that that the sort of future state, I think, gets us towards is the ability to check in real time still the validity of the credential, right? So it's not only is the document real, but is it still valid, right? So is my driving license still valid? And that sort of check back the source or the revocation of that as part of it, or even, you know, a state government credential, you know, working with children's check, is it the real-time check of that is really important for businesses to be able to have confidence that, you know, it's a bad example to use in public, but did Andrew, you know, does he still have the valid credential? Or has it been revoked for any reason?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think it's an important point. We're going to see this emergence of a more educated public around requesting and asking. We want to really encourage that, to ask for those validated credentials, and that will hopefully help to reduce some of that fraud and crime as well.
And it's that raising awareness so people know what the issues and frauds that we're actually seeing. So I'm continually talking about kind of Gen AI fraud just to make people aware of what the risks are associated with. It's about education. The more we educate, the more we can protect. It's not about just the technology solution. We've got to deal with the human side as well. Because if we kind of do the real good and kind of close down from a technical side, the scammers start to do from that kind of how do we actually think about and kind of talking about social engineering from the scam perspective and actually trying to impersonate. So it still needs that human side.
Thanks very much. Just in terms of, I was wondering if each of you could share with the room what you see the dream scenario as, like you solve the fragmentation, you solve the consumer concerns about data minimization, and also on the government side about a single identity or identity card of a citizen. You solve all of that. What do you see, each of you? What's your vision for how this infrastructure could work? Andrew?
I mean, as an individual, I just really want to get away from showing, you know, my paper and plastic documents when I turn up somewhere. Even, you know, checking into a hotel last night here. I think most of my team know this, but I'll be painful to go out because I'm the guy that asks the questions around, oh, why are you asking for my driving license? Yeah. Where are you going to store that? You know, yeah, I'm not fun to go on holiday with my wife. But It is that user-centric thing that I'm really excited about, to be able to just choose where do I want to share, my information, from what source, and know that it's just in some scenarios an attestation, right? So it's just that I am over 18. You don't need to know my date of birth. I'd really rather you don't store that, but I am over 18 and be able to use it. So as an individual, I'm really excited about that. I'm also really excited for the future where I can do that internationally. And we start to think about global interoperability and cross-border use cases, right? My not so subtle accent, right? I had to move here, start from scratch sort of 3 years ago with no digital footprint really in this country. That would have been great if I could do that, to rent a property, to set up a new telco SIM plan, open a bank account, start a job using a existing digital identity. I'd make that far, far more straightforward. But what I guess I'm excited for as well in the future as a sort of third, but just cautious that we need to make sure we continue to think about is make sure we capture the digital divide, right? So we're talking a lot about, using documents or valid sort of existing documents or transforming those today. How do we do that for those who are under-documented or underserved, right? In particular, sort of First Nations and Aboriginal Australians. So how do we do that and we don't show up and just replicate a 100-point check as is today in a digital world? So it's something we think about a lot, and we're thinking about how do we make sure we have a truly inclusive digital identity economy and not just a replication of where we are today.
Thanks, Andrew. Cassandra?
Yeah, so it's probably a couple of things. So the first one is really around confidence and ease. So having business, individuals and the community confident about who they're working with, who they're volunteering with, and making it really easy for that to happen. But that confidence and ease is really underpinned by good regulatory frameworks. So what I'd like to see in the future is simplified regulatory frameworks, but the ability to use the technology that's developing to really make sure that people who shouldn't be working with children or shouldn't be driving don't get permission to do those things. What that doesn't mean is that they don't have an identity. Everybody has the right to an identity. They might just not have permission to do certain things. And I think that point's really important, because when we think about inclusivity, there are a lot of people who are coming to Australia at the moment who find it really hard, for example, to get a working with children check, police check, an NDIS check, because they don't have enough documents. And we really need to make it easy, but have that integrity so it is inclusive, but we also protect people within our community to make sure that it's okay when those people are working with them or volunteering with them.
Thanks, Cassandra. Paul?
Yeah, I think it's along the same lines. I think from a user perspective, accessibility, ease of use makes my life a hell of a lot easier. With my compliance hat on, talking about the legislation, having it so it's technology agnostic, but it's risk-based and principles-based, so people can actually manage to the intent of the risk. I think companies need to be acting, I'd hate to say it, more ethically. They want to just pay lip service to compliance. They're ticking boxes along the way. They're not actually managing to the intent of the risk. So we start to see an actual better legislative framework with oversight and actually enforcement to actually kind of keep everyone honest. Then from the risk perspective, we've obviously got a hell of a lot better. Fraudsters are not making as much money. That makes everything a little bit more better underneath. There's a huge amount of money in organised crime. When you think about the actual cost of actual fraud losses, they were talking around, it's like $485 billion in a year. That is a huge amount of money of losses. But then for the companies, they have to do 4 times that on top of that just to kind of think about the operational costs. So that starts to go, right, there's a whole economy, and unfortunately an underground economy. When the money's moving, that starts to move away and life starts to get better. We save the planet. Self-world peace.
Yeah. Thanks very much. We might have just time for 1 or 2 questions. This is a great opportunity. You've got 3 of the experts in the field here. Does anyone have a question? Is there?
What should fintechs do to help you bring what I think is infrastructure that you're developing for this new, hopefully ubiquitous framework of identity options? What sort of things can fintechs do to engage with you all today, and what ideas should we be thinking about to bring your infrastructures to life?
So it's a fantastic question, and there's a great opportunity for the fintech sector. In Victoria, we are looking at open banking, and I'm on a panel in a little bit of time to talk about that in a bit more detail. But when we look at the identity proofing goals that are in the digital ID rules, they require a commencement of identity document, a use in the community document, and the names match. There's a lot of opportunity in use in the community for fintech to really think through what does use in the community and what do those patterns look like? How do we help bring to bear the knowledge from our data and from patterns to be able to prove who's real and who's fake? So that's a really, really powerful thing that fintech can bring. I think there's also other opportunities to solve some of the inclusivity issues. So when we see people moving to Australia, their identity commences when they arrive here, but they had an identity before. And if we can tap into that stuff from before, that's also going to help us to be much more confident around identity. And they're just two examples in that identity space.
And I've just got one thing. Just from a fintech's perspective, you've got to be continuous kind of challenging the status quo. Legislation says one thing is written by a person, it's not probably continually always right. You've got to challenge and think about, is it actually challenging? Is this the right thing to do? It's not the case of can we, it's a case of more should we. So we've got to kind of continually everyone lift from that perspective.
Thanks for the question, Simone. We are well out of time, so it's time for us to wrap up. But before I do that, could you all please join me in thanking Andrew, Cassandra and Paul?